Chapter 3 Star Sun Salem. The great silvery keep of Siegehold sat quiet in the night air, reflecting stray moonbeams across the lake of life. At this time of night few people were about. 2 or 3 guards moved about its walls. A servant trotted silently through the courtyard from the barracks to the kitchens. An Akari enchanter stood on the roof, mesmerized by the stars. Around the crescent of the lake, the town of Lakesview sat fat and secure on the shoreline. It was a well-established town now, its people indulging in some trading, some agriculture, and much contentment. The nearby valleys and slopes of the Urquhart Hills and the immediate vicinity of Siegehold gave them all they wanted in food and recreation. Few within the town pushed themselves to do much more than enjoy what proximity to the wondrous lake was given to them by the magical keep and the extended family of the Sunsource resident within the luminous grey walls. Almost perfectly centered on the strip of the shore between Lakesview and Siegehold was a substantial stone building, over 5 stories high. Most of its large unglassed windows and permanently open doors faced the lake, as if the building wished to absorb as much of the breeze, or perhaps as much of the lake, as it could. From one of the ground floor doors, 2 Akari birdmen emerged. They walked slowly toward the lake, eventually standing in close conversation as the waters lapped at their feet. One wore an ivory-colored uniform with an embroidered device that resembled a twisted knot of golden braid centered on his chest. The other birdman had striking red plumage and hair, the skin of his face and hands so white they seemed to glow in the moonlight. Star Sun, Salem Sunsour, supreme ruler of Ten Sendor, stood at one of the windows in the map room of Siegehold, wondering what they talked about so quietly. Salem was one of the most powerful Akari enchanters born, a child of the star gods, and even though his keen eyesight could easily pick out the birdmen so far below, he balked at using his powers to listen at their actual words. Salem was ever polite, and he trusted the 2 men below as few others. Still, they were an enigmatic pair. Wingridge Curlclaw, the birdman in the ivory uniform, was captain of the Lake Guard, a somewhat eccentric force who had dedicated themselves entirely to the service and protection of the Star Sun. Even so, Salem sometimes felt they kept themselves at a distance, not only from the life of Siegehold, but even from himself. But in itself, that distance and its essential peculiarity was not surprising, and had a great deal to do with the birdman Wingridge currently conversed with, Spikefeather Truesong. The Lake Guard was formed exclusively from the 600 children Spikefeather had rescued from Talonspike many years ago. Rather than risk the children to possible griffin attack on the ice trails of Talonspike, Spikefeather had pleaded with the ferryman to take the children to safety via the waterways. The children had reached Siegehold safely, but they had been subtly changed by their experiences in the waterways with Orr, and when they reached their majorities they had formed the Lake Guard. They announced their complete dedication to the service of the Star Sun, and chose as their uniform breeches and plain ivory tunics with the strange emblem on their chest. None of the Lake Guard ever explained it. If no one quite understood the Lake Guard, then all trusted them. Again and again the Guard pledged their loyalty to the Star Sun. Their lives were dedicated to his word, their hearts to his cause. They might disappear for days, sometimes weeks on end, but they claimed their ultimate duty was always to the Star Sun. Salem, as everyone else, did not doubt it. They were an accepted part of Siegehold, and as mysterious as the keep itself. Spikefeather was almost enigmatic. He too had been changed by his contact with Orr the ferryman. As payment for Orr transporting the children to Siegehold, Spikefeather had dedicated his life to the ferryman, and for the past 20 years had spent much of his time in the waterways with Orr. What Spikefeather did down there, or what Orr did to the birdman, Salem did not know. As Salem watched, Wingridge and Spikefeather parted company, Wingridge rising slowly in the air toward the walls of Siegehold, where Salem supposed he would inspect the members of the Lake Guard station there, Spikefeather walking slowly about the shoreline of the lake, apparently deep in thought. Salem sighed and turned back into the circular map room. The center table was covered with documents, piles of accounts, reports from several of the major towns, and ledgers bound with ribbon and stuffed with loose pages. Salem fought the urge to sigh again, and wandered slowly over to the table, running a hand through his thick, close-cropped black curly hair. Was there never an end to the paperwork? Siegehold sometimes seemed full of secretaries and notaries and bureaucrats, all of them there supposedly to keep track of the vast amounts of paperwork that governing Tencendor somehow generated. But Salem sometimes wondered if they were of any use. His desk never seemed to clear of the damn stuff. No wonder Axis had handed control of Tencendor over to him. Salem smiled softly, thinking of his parents, and knowing in his heart that it was far more than paperwork that had seen them leave. Axis and Azure had remained at Siegehold while their children grew up into adulthood, but when Zenith, their youngest, had reached the age of 25, they had increasingly turned to their fellow star gods for companionship. 9 years ago, growing ever more inclined to the ethereal and wanting to spend more time exploring the mysteries of the stars, Axis had handed over full control of Tencendor to Salem in a magnificent ceremony on the shores of Grail Lake, where Axis had proclaimed Tencendor so many years ago. In the years since then, Salem had seen his parents only 3 or 4 times. They kept themselves remote, as befitted their status as gods, and Salem left to manage the realm of the mortals. Even though he had steered Tencendor for 9 years, and seen it successfully through several peaceful disputes, Salem still felt slightly uncomfortable about his position as supreme ruler. Axis had won his right to rule through sheer courage, through years spent on the fighting trail, through heartache, loss, and grief. Salem had been given the realm, almost literally on a golden platter. Oh, he'd been trained and guided and counseled for years beforehand. Axis had sent him for several 6-month periods to the great southern empire of Corellius, and once for 7 months to the intriguing little kingdom of Escator. At the hands not only of Axis himself, but other petty kings and grand emperors, Salem had studied the art of governance in depth. But still, Salem sometimes felt that he should have won his right to sit the throne of the stars, as his father had. Was the sheer luck of birth order enough to guarantee that a son had the skills and wisdom needed to govern so large a realm? What did his people actually think of him? I should get out there more often, Salem said to himself. Actually see what's going on, and not rely on reports. How long is it since I've left Siegehold? Too long, a soft voice put in from the window, and Salem turned about, unsurprised. He'd known who it was even before she spoke, for he'd felt her presence coalesce in the window as he'd muttered to himself. Zenith! He grinned and held out his hands. It's been days. Where have you been? His youngest sister jumped lightly down from the windowsill and hugged her brother tight. Unlike Salem, who remained barebacked like their parents, Zenith had glossy wings, as raven black as her hair. She was a beautiful bird woman, even more stunning than her mother, Azure. Mysterious, intriguing, and yet somehow sad, always apart from the life of Siegehold. Salem held the hug, wondering why. Even as a child, Zenith had seemed troubled. She had often slept badly, suffering formless nightmares, and on many days was withdrawn and uncommunicative. And sometimes Salem had caught her looking at him with an expression that was so unlike her that he'd wondered if... Why the frown? Zenith leaned back and took her brother's face briefly in her hands, kissing him lightly on the lips. Salem folded her wings against her back and stroked them softly. I was thinking, loveliest of sisters, that it is high time you also thought about fleeing. Why had he used that word? Salem stumbled slightly, but managed to carry on before Zenith could speak. Leaving Siegehold. How many years since you left? No, don't answer. Too many. That I know. Zenith quietened in that strange way she had, and Salem sensed a slight withdrawal. He stood back a little, but kept his hand lightly on her shoulders. Zenith? Stardrifter would love to see you, I'm sure. You spent a great deal of time with him when you were a child, and the island of mist and memory is a wondrous place. Maybe. She suddenly grinned, her dark blue eyes mischievous. Should I take Drago with me, as I did when I was a child? Zenith more than half suspected that Salem's suggestion was a roundabout way of ridding Siegehold of Drago's presence for a while. Salem dropped his hands and walked away from her. As you wish, he said, his voice toneless. But that wasn't what I meant. Zenith instantly regretted trying to joke about Drago. He was a constant note of disharmony within Siegehold, although he never said or did anything that could be in any way construed as sinister or hurtful. It was just that he was so different from his brothers and sisters. Salem, Riverstar, and Zenith, as also Israel, their half-brother, were the children of gods. They were highly magical beings, and their enchanted lives would likely stretch into infinity before they ended. Once Drago had been like them, briefly. Drago had been born the second child of Axis and Azure, the elder twin of Riverstar, and potentially one of the most powerful enchanters ever birthed. But even as a mewling infant, he had abused that power, allying himself with his father's foe, Gorgrail, and plotting to murder Salem so that Drago might inherit his place. As punishment, Azure had disinherited him of his Ikari powers. Now 40 years on, Drago wandered the corridors of Siegehold, a dark and enigmatic mortal, aging into useless thin-faced middle years as he watched his brothers and sisters glory in their youth and enchanted powers. Salem was never able to trust him. Even knowing his powers had gone, it was Salem who had been the object of Drago's infant ambitions, who had been subject to the terror of kidnap and abuse by Gorgrail. And it was Salem who was daily reminded of that horror every time he caught sight of Drago from the corner of his eyes. Zenith knew that Salem made every effort to avoid Drago whenever he could, but even in a place as large as Siegehold, the brothers constantly ran into each other. "I'm sorry," she said softly to Salem's back. "I did not mean to jest." He turned his head her way and smiled slightly. "It does not matter, Zenith. Drago does not—" There was a knock at the door, and it opened without waiting for Salem's word. Wingridge Curlclaw entered, stopped after precisely 5 paces, and saluted Salem. "Starson." "Wingridge, what is it?" Wingridge glanced at Zenith, but made no comment on her presence. "Starson, a courier bird has just arrived from Carlon with a message from Prince Ascom." Salem took the parchment, unrolled it with the snap of his wrist, and ran his eyes over the text. "Curse him oh, damn him!" he cried, and Zenith laid a concerned hand on his arm. "Salem, what is it?" "That cursed fool has just levied a third tax on all goods moved along the Nordra and along the roadways of the West. And slapped a tax on any and every man and family who wants to move to the north to live. Gods, look at the amount! That figure must have come to him when he was suffering a nightmare caused by chronic constipation. Oh, I can't believe this!" He threw the parchment on the table and stalked away to the window, standing and staring out as he fought to regain his temper. Gods! But Ascom and Zared had given him more trouble combined than Bornheld and Gorgrail had ever given his father. He was sure of it. How many times had he had to draw one or the other aside for some diplomatic advice? Between them, they controlled half the territory of Tensendor. Was it too much to ask of them to try and do that in something even vaguely resembling peace? Zenith looked at Wingridge, who remained completely expressionless, then picked up the parchment and briefly scanned the contents herself. Her eyes widened as she slowly put it down. No wonder Salem had reacted so strongly. "Salem," she said, and waited for her brother to look at her. "Salem, this time something needs to be done to solve their problems. And Leah, you must surely end her misery soon." Although Zenith had not seen Leah in some 4 years, they remained in close touch. Zenith not only knew how much Leah hungered for Zared, she understood why Salem and Ascom were going to deny Leah her heart's desire. Poor Leah, she thought. It's time she was told to move on with her life. 5 years of alternating between misery and gut-wrenching hope was too long for anyone. Salem nodded slowly and rubbed his face with one hand. He suddenly looked very, very tired. The time has come to solve this. Askham has gone too far with his debt, and Zered should have been astute enough in the first instance to know that a marriage between him and Leah, especially with Bethiam remaining so stubbornly barren, would be a political impossibility. He drew a deep breath. This needs not only my authority, but the weight of the Council of Five. Zenith's eyes widened. The heads of the leading 5 families of Tensendor only met on a biannual basis. To call them in now, not 8 months since their last meeting, bespoke how serious Salem thought the problem was. As ruler of Tensendor, Salem's final word was law. Legally, he did not need to call the council to this matter, but he obviously felt both Zered and Askham needed the judgment of their peers as well as his own word. Wingridge? Wingridge snapped to attention. Send couriers to Zered, Sadomai, Freefall, Ilgane, and Askham. We meet with the utmost haste, no longer than the 7th day 3 weeks from now. And send for Israel as well. Israel, now Mage King of the Avar, was not officially a member of the Council of Five, and did not have a vote. But for the past 10 years he had attended all the meetings, and given and listened to advice. As Salem's half-brother, and leader of one of Tensendor's 3 main races, he was usually invited as a courtesy. Besides, no one particularly liked to make a decision in Israel's absence that might subsequently annoy him. As Wingridge put his hand on the doorknob, Salem called him back. No, wait. Leave Askham. I will send a personal courier rather than one of yours. Wingridge nodded and was gone. Zenith? Salem smiled at his sister, although his eyes remained tired and careworn. Why don't you tell Askham? Me? But the bridge can connect you to Spiredor easily enough, and from there it's only a short flight across Grail Lake to Carlon. But why me? Because I think Leah should be here as well. I need to tell her my decision, and I'd rather do it to her face than by courier bird. Don't you want to see her? Bring them both back by Spiredor. Askham can send his escort north by more conventional means. I don't know that I want to leave. Salem's voice hardened into a command. You need to be more involved with Tensendor, Zenith. I am asking you to go, but if you wish, I can make your departure slightly more compulsory. Zenith's chin tilted up, and in that movement Salem saw all of his mother's fire and determination. As you wish, brother. I shall leave before sunrise. And with a slight but noticeable twitch of her shoulders, she brushed past him and left the room.